Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast all about your Kindle. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is May 9th, 2018. Greetings from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am putting this episode up for an earlier than usual release on Wednesday. That's because I want TKC 510 to hit the nets on publication day for a book that I think you may be hearing quite a lot about in the coming weeks in the national media. The title is Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America by James Fallows and Deborah Fallows.
One of the threads that goes through the entire book is the difference between politics at the national level, which is so poisonous and divided and no compromise, and the way things work in many communities and a number of states.
Also this week, one of Apple's original luminaries praises Jeff Bezos not for his corporate leadership, but for his power as a writer. And Amazon is testing another one of those kind of creepy services that might just end up becoming normal one day. First up in news is a post I spotted last week by Jean-Louis Gassée, who was a highly visible executive at Apple in the 1980s. The piece appeared on the Medium platform. It was titled Bezos, a CEO Who Can Write. Gassée took the time to read closely all 20 of the letters to shareholders that Amazon's founder and CEO has written. What the former Apple executive did not discover was what he calls typical corpo speak, in which, quote, there is no music, no soul, no human reaching out to us. By comparison, he writes, Bezos, quote, rejoices, occasionally apologizes, and always expounds his company's management philosophy and practices, and he does so with wit and good grace. Well, for the past 10 years, I have carefully read most of Bezos' epistles to shareholders, and I heartily agree with Gassée's high marks for Jeff as an author. That happens to be a category that he shares with his wife, the award-winning novelist Mackenzie Bezos. Gassée sees Amazon's CEO, quote, growing more confident as he breaks from the traditional form. He also playfully refers to him as Brother Bezos, using the title for a monk, and that's because of the way that Jeff's exhortations sometimes go past educating and inspiring all the way to what sounds like preaching. With this year's letter, Gassée writes, Bezos is back at the pulpit. He often refers to himself and his troops as missionaries, as he forcefully dismisses PowerPoint in favor of written memos. Gassée was so impressed with this year's shareholder letter that he downloaded the entire collection of them, going back 20 years, and, as he says, devoured them. He makes a terrific suggestion when he says, I hope someone somewhere has done a better job than Amazon's site putting the compilation together in a consistent and directly accessible fashion. You'll find in the show notes Gassée's link to the entire collection of letters as listed at Amazon's media relations site. It would make a great Kindle book, but at this point you have to click individually on each of the PDFs in order to read the letters. Gassée concludes his post by stating if he were 20 years younger, he would love to teach a business school course based on the Bezos letters to shareholders. But he added this caveat. Most of the strategies and practices advocated by Amazon's founder have broad applicability, but a central mystery remains. Bezos himself, his combination of early life experiences, intellect, emotional abilities, and communication skills. Being Bezos isn't teachable. Well said. As it happens, I had a chance to see another genius with shareholders in action this past Saturday in Omaha. Darlene's sister Deb owns some Berkshire Hathaway stock, and that meant she had 4 passes to the annual meeting. We joined her an hour and a half before the meeting was scheduled to start at the CenturyLink Center, which holds 18,300 people. By then, the line snaked outside about a quarter of the way around the arena, and by the time we passed through a light security screen, the only seats available were behind the stage. We couldn't see Buffett and Charlie Munger directly, but we could see them on a big screen that we were facing. It was nice just to be in the arena. I was afraid we were going to end up in some kind of an overflow room, but we did manage to score some seats at the event itself. These meetings are, as you can imagine, a big deal in Omaha, and by the license plates in the parking lot, there was clearly interest from all around the country, and we also saw visitors from overseas. Buffett is going to be 88 on my birthday, August 30th, and he fielded questions for several hours with his partner Charlie Munger, who was a spry 94. We left before it was over for a hearty brunch at an Omaha diner. I read in coverage of the meeting that Buffett told shareholders he made, quote, the wrong decisions, unquote, when he passed up investments in Amazon and Google, now named Alphabet. Quote, I had a very, very, very high opinion of Jeff Bezos' ability when I first met him, and I underestimated him, Buffett said in comments. This is reported by CNBC. He continued, I've watched Amazon from the start. I think what Jeff Bezos has done is something close to a miracle. The problem is, when I think something will be a miracle, I tend not to bet on it. Parenthetically, Buffett has spoken out very harshly against Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and you can find people on both sides of this. There was an amazing debate at that's Intelligence Squared debate in New York. Two people arguing that Bitcoin is going to be bigger than the internet, and the other two arguing that it was a bubble and it wasn't necessarily going to be the thing which determines the future. The team which was arguing against Bitcoin scored a big win in that debate. They moved more people to their side by the time the debate was over. Interesting. Buffett may be right on that one, but I don't think we know. I love that one because you can hear intelligent people argue either side of whether Bitcoin and blockchain really are going to be the next big thing, bigger than the internet, as I passed along to you from my enthusiasm about it at South by Southwest this year. The second news item I want to mention is another one of those cases where Amazon seems to be innovating just a few ticks beyond most of our comfort zones. Listener Steve Lehos emailed me a link to a Fox News story titled, Amazon is starting to scan customers' bodies in the name of online shopping. No, this is not a joke. According to a paywall-protected Wall Street Journal story, Amazon is inviting customers into a New York office in order to keep tabs on their body shape and size over a 20-week time period. The volunteers participating will visit the office twice a month to help Amazon better understand, quote, how bodies change shape over time. That's according to the survey that led to the volunteer invitations. In return, participants will receive Amazon gift cards worth up to $250. Well, we know Amazon is making a big push into the clothing business. We haven't heard much about that Echo Look device, which takes photos of you and offers AI-enabled opinions on which outfit looks best. Although it was introduced more than a year ago, the Look is still available by invitation only. This new initiative, or the report of it, appears to be in the same general category of Amazon getting to know what customers want in clothing, perhaps before we know it ourselves. For the tech tip, I want to pass along the following email from Scott Ornat in Minnesota. Hi, Len. I paused your latest episode, TKC 509, interview with Seamus Bellamy, to share my experience with removing special offers from my Kindle Fire HD8. After I received my HD8 in January, I very much liked it, except for one feature, the garish, overcolored ads for kids' games blasting my eyeballs every time I'd open it up. I've had special offers on my regular Kindles for years, but they were almost always ads for books and were in monochrome, so I didn't mind them that much. I even bought a few books from those ads. I contacted Amazon via their help chat box and just asked if there was any way to filter or specify ads I did not want to see. The chatbot, or real person who knows the difference these days, said they could not custom filter the ads, but instead offered to remove the special offers from my HD8 at no charge. Of course, I said yes, and seconds later they were gone. I'm not guaranteeing that this will work for everyone, but it did for me, and it greatly enhanced my enjoyment of my HD8 as I open it up now to a pleasant mountain path view. Bye now from your long-term fan, Scott Ornat. Thanks, Scott, for writing that. It confirms my impression, based on what I've heard from some other listeners, that if you ask, Amazon will remove special offers from your Fire or Kindle without requiring the $20 payment. I think it's a good policy, and I'm glad to hear that it still seems to be the guide for tech support reps who receive inquiries like Scott's. Time now for the interview. James Fallows is a national correspondent for The Atlantic and has written for the magazine since the late 1970s. He once worked as President Jimmy Carter's speechwriter, and he worked briefly at Microsoft just a few months, helping them improve Microsoft Word's user interface. His wife, Deborah Fallows, is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and the author of Dreaming in Chinese, based on the couple's years in China. I met Jim and Deb more than 45 years ago in college at the Harvard Crimson daily newspaper, where he was the mild-mannered and brilliant president of the Crimson, and they were what I thought was an adorable couple who had met on a blind date. As an aspiring member of the paper's news staff, I held Jim in very high esteem and have done so ever since. Those were difficult years at Harvard and other universities. Harvard, there was a takeover of the administration building, and the university essentially stalled out as an institution for my sophomore year in the wake of the student unrest and the clumsy reaction to it by the school administration. One night when I was serving as night editor at the Crimson, I had difficulty reading the copy because of tear gas wafting in from Plimpton Street. Throughout this chaos, Jim Fallows held the paper to high journalistic standards through sheer force of intellect and character, is how I saw it. And I experienced his calming, insightful presence in a newsroom populated by very big youthful egos, some of whom, like Frank Rich, Michael Kinsley, and E.J. Dionne, went on to become notable journalists themselves. That's by way of saying that I would have been very pleased to have the authors of this book on my show, even if there hadn't been a personal history. But because there was, I was especially gratified that they were able to schedule me in for an interview, which I conducted by Skype from Omaha. Jim set up a joint Skype call so I could see both of them on a split screen of Skype, and they could see me, and the audio was pretty good quality. A powerful feature of this book is that it's written by Jim and Deb in separate sections, and as you read the book, you start feeling the rhythm of their different points of view, and we'll talk about that in the interview. Because of really the importance of voice in telling the stories that they captured from all around the country, I thought it would be interesting to start with them reading from the book. So you'll first hear from Deb as she's reading from the introduction, and then Jim follows by reading from an early section of the book as well.
We had flown nearly 100,000 miles in nearly 4 years in our small plane, with Jim as pilot and me in the right seat. We began in my home territory of the upper Midwest, then headed over to Maine and flew south through New England and the mid-Atlantic states to Georgia and Florida. We swept farther through the deep south to Texas and the southwest, up the Central Valley of California to Oregon and Washington, and closed the loop after leaving Montana. All the while, we snaked in and out of the so-called flyover country through Wyoming and Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and much more. We've landed in dozens of towns and cities along the way, anticipating in each of them the local stories that would organize themselves into some kind of composed narrative about the backbone and character of the region, and maybe beyond that, to help explain the character of the country. We began by looking for towns with positive energy, with signs of rebounds from some kind of shock or shift, like a mine or factory that had closed, or waves of people who had departed, or newcomers who had arrived. We ended up adding towns with down-and-out reputations where we truly feared for what we might find. Life upon landing was never quite what we'd planned. We've stayed in towns for weeks at a time. We've often revisited them, following threads from one person or one group or town institution or movement to the next, settling into the local rhythm. We've gone to town plays and musicals, sat in on civic meetings, hung out at coffee shops and brew pubs, spent days at schools, libraries, and ball games, taken tours of downtowns, visited factories, startups, and community college classes, taken boat rides and bike rides, swum in local pools, and run on high school tracks. We borrowed cars and stayed in motels, private homes, and one-off eco-hotels. We remained long enough to begin to imagine how much we didn't know, but also to appreciate the unusual opportunity we've had in seeing a broader sampling of modern America's realities than most of its citizens will ever have a chance to do.
Yay, well done, Deb. There is a high-toned tradition of road trips as a means of discovering America, from Lewis and Clark and Tocqueville through John Dos Passos, John Steinbeck, and William Least Heat Moon. Apart from other obvious points of contrast, our project is different in that rather than going by car or wagon or pirogue, we've gone from city to city in our family's small single-engine propeller airplane, a Cirrus SR-22. This was a decision made for convenience, for beauty, and for edification. The convenience comes from the simple fact that almost any settlement in America is within close range of a place where a small airport can land. Some 5,000 public landing facilities, many of them built for military purposes during and after World War II, are scattered about the United States, making many more remote hamlets more easily reachable by air than by other means. The beauty comes from the unending fascination of watching the American landscape unfurl below you as you travel at low altitude. At the dawn of powered flight a century ago, it was assumed that writers and painters would want to become aviators, and vice versa. Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and Ernest K. Gann were flyers who wrote. Beryl Markham, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and Anne Morrow Lindbergh were writers who flew, because of the unique perspective on civilization and nature offered by the aerial view. From ground level, America is mainly road. After all, that's where cars can take you. From the sky, America is mainly forest in the eastern third, farmland in the middle, then mountain and desert in the west, before the strip of intense development along the California coast. It's also full of features obvious from the sky that are much harder to notice from the ground and are difficult to pick out from 6 miles up in an airliner. Some of the most striking are quarries at the edge of most towns to provide gravel for roads and construction sites, prisons instantly identifiable by their fencing, though some mega high schools can look similar, usually miles from the nearest town or tucked into locations where normal traffic won't pass by, and the vast sea of parking lot spaces surrounding shopping malls on the edges of town. We never tire of the view from this height. As different from the normal, grim airliner perspective as scuba diving is from traveling on a container ship.
That's great. That's a good introduction. I think in Deb's intro there, you mentioned that when you got to the ground, it was always a surprise in each town. And when you look back, I'm wondering if it's a place to start talking about your adventure in your book. What was the biggest surprise about America that you think you'll carry with you from having spent this time and written this book?
I think probably the biggest surprise is how pervasive are these efforts of local citizenship, local engagement, local enthusiasm that people have in their hometowns for making things better in the old traditional American spirit of generosity and creativity and inventiveness. All of this came at the beginning during a time when the national mood seemed pretty dark, and we had this hunch that things might be different when we went out to see the towns. And then discovering them one by one and seeing the patterns that the same kinds of things were happening from town to town really eventually impressed me, and I think us, of that this was an America we hadn't really heard that much about lately, and was the best of America still there and thriving.
I guess my version of the surprise is, in addition to the million specific things we're writing about, from libraries being so strong and the way there are all these innovative schools in the South, I would oversimplify it as saying there is a there, by which I mean Deb is from small town Ohio, I'm from small town California, and so we had some sense of that texture of the country. But the narrative for the last couple of years in American politics is essentially you have activity on the coast, and the rest of the country is this giant object that things are done to and people suffer from and are resentful within. And obviously we know about those big trends, but the sense of all of this dispersed activity of every place we went, this world that was reconstructing itself and thinking about its future. So the there-ness of interior America, I think was a surprise to me.
You mentioned at one point that one of the qualities that you noticed in the successful towns was that there was a civic story, and that when you asked, people knew the story. Why do you think that is such a telling bit of evidence as to how well a town is doing?
One of the divisions that stuck with me that a person mentioned early on is places you go to sort of consume what is already there, like moving to Paris, and places you go because you're going to help build not the next Paris, but the next, the next vibrant place, and a place where people are because they want to help make something of it, whether it's their families or their businesses or their institutions. It really helps to have a narrative of how what you're doing today connects with what you hope for 10 years from now and what you hope for your children. And you see it on the national level with the American story, which is oversimplified and a lie in many ways, but there's essential arc to it that everybody understands of how America stumbles its way forward. And if you have towns at various stages of their development, whether it's Charleston, West Virginia, dealing with the coal aftermath, or Allentown, PA, trying to rebuild its downtown, or Mississippi, just dealing with being Mississippi, the idea of connecting what happened last year with what we're doing today and what we hope for tomorrow, I think that is the power of the narrative.
I think it's very interesting town by town how when people have a sense of where their town came from and where they want it to go, you see that expression played out in the local arts. For example, in Dodge City, which was, kind of built around the Gunsmoke days, and the trains were going through and they were moving cattle. It was an important part of their past history. And then when Gunsmoke came along, this kind of, semi-fictional, semi-non-fictional great TV series that people loved and associated with Dodge City, the town now knows that and honors that and uses it as part of not only their tourist trade, but how they show themselves. In for example, we were there during the 4th of July, and there was a festival down by the Dodge old saloon area. And there was this Dodge City band that had been playing for about 100 years. They, every Tuesday night in the summer, they all get together and they all play these old songs and they perform for people. And it's part of carrying on traditions like that and renovating the downtown. The old train station where they had moved the cattle around is now an Amtrak station, but it's renovated and rehabilitated in the old style, and they'll have the art walk start on Main Street and end up at the train station to kind of bring everything of the history together in this participatory, common way that recalls what their past is and gives people a hook into having them experienced where we came from and where we are now.
I think in the book there's a map and it shows no state boundaries. It just shows the communities. And I wondered if, as you were focusing on communities and what's happening that's vibrant, did you notice any states that were acting more like local communities than the national government?
That's very interesting too. And I guess one of the threads that goes through the entire book is the difference between politics at the national level, which is so poisonous and divided and no compromise, and the way things work in many communities and a number of states. And this is set up for saying that some of the places where we saw the most effective coordination between a state government and local businesses and NGOs was in the South. I'm thinking in particular of South Carolina and Georgia and Mississippi, where the innovative schools there were, in some cases, they were these so-called governor's schools in South Carolina and Mississippi that were really, really inventive. And any fancy education state would want to sort of see, well, what's Mississippi doing with this school? But also attracting the businesses to revive the economies of these areas, and particularly training the racially very diverse, economically often left behind, educationally often left behind populations of rural Mississippi, coastal Georgia, and interior South Carolina. The state government in those places, very conservative by our normal axis, was taking this activist sort of national development role for their state. And so that was to us a sign of functioning of the real public, private, state, local, business, NGO interaction.
We also saw some of this taking place on the regional level, and sometimes it crossed state boundaries. In Burlington, Vermont, which is right across from the more troubled Plattsburgh, New York, they would look to each other and, at least to some degree, try to reach out to each other across state boundaries. Same kind of thing between Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin, where you can see the business kind of crossing over the river, the edge of Lake Superior right there, from Minnesota into Wisconsin to be part of a region. And it didn't matter what state it is. Same kind of thing in Erie, Pennsylvania, where some of these towns are so far from anything else that they look to their community, whether it's in their state or in their region or kind of nearby, to help each other out and to build some kind of synergy for what's going on. I think that's a next stage beyond the local community effort.
Yeah, makes sense. Deb, you're a linguist, and some of the most intriguing parts of the book were your fine ear to what you were listening around the country. Where did you hear the most musical way of speaking? Oh,
the most musical way is definitely the South. I mean, you've got these long, drawn-out diphthongs, and you can't say you got to say y'all, and you can't, all of the words like high become high, just drawn out, and hat is hayat.
Two syllables.
It just takes two syllables. It takes a long time to talk because you have a lot more to say. And also, people seem in the South, I would say, consider it something of an art form. The protocol of speaking, it's not just, hi, how are you? It's, hi, how are you? Well, let me tell you about the wedding I'm going to this afternoon and what I'm going to wear and what flavor cake it's going to be. So a brief greeting ends up to be a very artistic conversation, even if it's about not really anything.
Interesting. I talk a lot about Amazon on this podcast, and your hometown newspaper was acquired by Jeff Bezos 5 years ago, and I assume you both read it pretty carefully. How would you describe maybe your hopes and fears when you first got that news that the Grahams were selling it to Bezos, and then your experience, or kind of what sort of a grade would you give the new owner so far?
The news of the Graham family selling the Washington Post was of emotional sadness to everybody in D.C. because, of course, even during our first conscious time in D.C., back during the Watergate era, the Post was, of course, the champion of that. Along with the New York Times, they were leading the investigation. Katharine Graham was sort of the social leader of the town, and so it was clearly the Post had been an early casualty of shifts in underlying economics over the past of the decade before. Don Graham finally sold it, and so it was just a sad moment, and people didn't know what to expect. I think almost everybody, with the exception of Donald Trump, would say that the Bezos era for the Washington Post has been very good for the Post. That there is very little sign that Bezos has intervened, except in trying to shore up the technological foundations of the Post business. Not in its coverage. There are routinely critical stories about Amazon, the business section on the front page. And to me, so I think it's very good the Post is robust again. It has a palpable sense of momentum, and this is their time. The larger pattern I hope this suggests is that one of my theories is it's the second Gilded Age, and so we need to have the good side, the original Gilded Age, which includes plutocrats who have been enriched on the technology of this era, doing what the previous era's Carnegies and Mellons and Fricks and Heinzes and Fords and Rockefellers did with their money, which is to shore up the public infrastructure of those days. So I hope that Jeff Bezos sets a pattern. I should say that The Atlantic, where I've worked forever, is in the process of being acquired by Laurene Powell Jobs, whose Emerson Collective is one of these that has grown from the technology of this era. So I hope actually there becomes a pattern of let's do something like what Jeff Bezos has done with the Post, what Laurene Powell Jobs is doing with her Emerson Collective, and apply this era's fortunes to shoring up something that really needs help, which is journalism.
Deb, any thoughts?
Jim's really the expert on the journalism here. I think one thing we did see in a number of the small towns, Burlington, Vermont, Greenville, South Carolina, I'm sure there are more, are the alt weeklies that are really digging in Erie, Pennsylvania, and strong, covering covering local news in depth, and they're really interesting to read, even if you're not from there. And they do what seems to be done best: concentrate on the important issues, bring in the local history, use a lot of young people with their perspective, and just kind of speaking to people around town. That was where those existed. It was a really encouraging sign, and I think anybody going in trying to get into journalism might look to places like that and move there.
Exactly. I wonder if when you were visiting with people in the communities that were doing great things, did they usually seem aware that they weren't alone, that there were people like them all across the country doing it? And do you see the book as a way to kind of connect the dots so that there's sort of a dawning awareness that maybe these people hadn't had until you flew in and started talking to them?
So you have captured our fondest hope and strongest passion, which is that we didn't know until we were traveling around that things happening in Fresno were like those happening in Allentown, were like those happening in Duluth. And I think people there largely don't know. And there are these sort of overlapping diasporas of downtown redevelopment people and library people and maker movement people and all these other people. And they may have some connections, but I think there is not as much of a sense as we now have of just the momentum behind this kind of dispersed nationwide reinvention. So yes, we really feel gospel passion to try to connect these dots. Right, Deb?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. One little example of that is the librarians that I met. Libraries are such busy, active hubs of civic energy. It's so much more than just borrowing books these days. And if I heard it once, I probably heard it 8 or 10 times, where librarians would say with some kind of sadness, we're the best kept secret in town, because they're trying to reach out not only to their communities, but they're trying to reach out to each other and learn the secrets of why they're doing well, and finding models and saying, hey, if you can do that here. I never thought that seed lending program like you're doing in Duluth might work here in Omaha. Maybe they have one, but I think people are starting to catch up with them, with incipient national organizations or national organizations that are starting to recognize these local efforts and publicize those more. But as Jim said, that's really one of what we feel like is our missions, is to go out and talk about these things out loud.
It strikes me that after flying 100,000 miles together in a small plane and writing your first book together, that you may have learned as much about the state of your marriage as the state of America. And I wonder if there were any blinding insights that from Duluth or somewhere else that you could pass along as, how do you do that? You've been married a long time, and what did you learn in this adventure that helped you to have a better marriage?
I think I should.
Who goes first?
I think you go first, Deb.
Okay. I mean, we have been married a very long time. We've known each other for 50 years now, and essentially been together all of that time. By the time we started this project, I think, we had worked out all the kinks. We knew who was good at what. We knew who wasn't good at what, and didn't really even have to talk about who would do what on this project. We just kind of went with, I'm more logistics. Jim is more big think. So things like that fell into place just kind of naturally. And to my recollection, I would hound Jim of, we got to make this decision. Where are we going to go next or whatever? And he would say, well, wait, we've got to figure out what we're going for. So, but that's been our whole life. I think if I learned one thing, it reinforced something we've learned all along through our kind of weird trajectory of moving around in our life, is that we were just trying to survive through a lot of these adventures. There was so much to do, and mistakes we tried to avoid and things we tried to take advantage of, that there was no room left. There was little room left to sweat the small stuff, like, don't you ever put the top on your toothpaste tube or something like that. To me, I learned to overlook those things more.
Yeah. Sure. It would never come up.
So it was not sweating the small stuff and survival, which, was just part of the deal.
How about you, Jim?
So Deb and I have been together for a long time. We met when we were 18, 50 years ago. We got married when we were 21. We've been together since that time. And so I think the two secrets were, number one, my having fortunately found the exact right person at the right time, and being the most important decision in my life, or happy circumstance in my life. But also that at every stage of things we've done, we've been sort of plunging ourselves into the middle of something new, of moving to Texas for Deb's graduate school, and moving to Japan, and moving to China, and taking our kids to Malaysia when they were little, and saying, kids, it'll be fun. And then just decided it was time together to try to learn about this next stage. With Deb initially humoring me for the aviation approach, and then coming to accept it and becoming a very skillful right seat passenger and air traffic control listener, and all. So I think that the ongoing adventure has kept us. We're like a bicycle that has to keep moving, so it doesn't.
Well, David Brooks had a wonderful column early last year where his observation was that you two always seem to move where history is being made, and he was tracking all the various places that you've showed up at fraught moments. Do you have any inklings yet of where you will be going next?
Great question, yeah.
Yes. So, Deb, over to you.
Yeah, the answer is right here. It seems to us that this country is the most exciting place in the world right now. Jim, elaborate.
Yes. So David Brooks, in his very nice column, was saying that we had ended up being places where history was being created. And I do feel that the history of our shared beloved country is being worked out right now in one way in Washington, and we know that way in which the history is unfolding, but then in a much more positive way in Gary and in Eau Claire and in Stockton and in Lubbock. And so the question is how that balance is going to be set. And we want to do everything we can to spread the story of the positive side of that balance, not in a sappy way, but just saying, here are the things you may not know about, in which Houston's efforts are like those of Portland, Oregon, and they're like those of St. Louis. And the potential for the right side of this balance prevailing is increased if people are more aware of what the potential is.
In your dedication of our towns to your grandchildren, Jack, Tide, Eleanor, Navy, you tell them this is your country, quite moving. How optimistic are you that the country that we're turning over to them is going to make it?
When we all first met, when I was studying American history in college, the lesson I took from American history, which I studied then and afterwards, is America has always been in trouble, and that only a nation with as many things going for it as the U.S. has could have got through as many problems as the U.S. had. Worst of all, obviously, the Civil War, but a dysfunctional national government, all the rest. Through my reportorial lifetime, I've seen a number of crises for the American system, which the U.S. has so far managed to muddle its way through. That does not guarantee continued muddling, but I guess I personally am more heartened than I thought I would be by all this resilient capacity around the country. So, Deb, will we make it?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm going to say we'll make it. Yes, and it's the generations that are coming up that are, it's their turn to help make this right now. And they're not the ones whining about the GM plant that is closed. They're out there thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? And being very creative and inventive. And, you see it everywhere, all the startups, all the tech economies, everything that's happening. And I think they're also mindful of training that next generation, their own kids, to be fluent in what they need to do, all of the technology, but also kind of protective of them to, I hope, let them kind of take their own reins when it's their turn to build on what they have. So it feels to me like there's a continuum going on. We'll stop listening to the whiners and just kind of take charge and move out to turn things in ways that are going to help people. And for all of their volunteerism and service orientation, I think it's really true. They are casting a wide net to take account of neighbors and new arrivals in the country and all the rest.
I have been speaking with James Fallows and Deborah Fallows, authors of Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. Thanks very much to you both.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you, Len.
I am not sure yet who you are going to hear on the show next week. It might be some kind of a departure from the usual fare. I'm in the midst of a really busy week here in Cambridge for things that I flew out here to do. On Friday, I'm going to attend the 50th reunion of my high school class at Belmont Hill School, one of the few all-boys private schools left in America. Yesterday, May 8th, I took Uber to Dedham, Mass. to take delivery of our new red Tesla Model 3. And tomorrow night, Thursday, at a Cambridge Zoning Board hearing on our home remodeling project, we need a variance, I'm going to experience local government in action. I hope it's going to be as constructive an experience as what we heard about from Jim and Deb Fallows. If there's a thread in all of this, I may try to pull it together for TKC 511, which will return to the usual release day on Friday. The arrival of Tess, our Model 3, has inspired me to relaunch the Edge of the Road podcast. Yesterday's episode captured the orientation that I received before driving the car away from the dealership. I actually sat in the driveway or the parking lot of the dealership for about 45 minutes just to let everything sink in that I'd been told by the really sharp technician that guided me through it. And just, it's a very different kind of car, and I wanted to sit in it before I drove it out onto a busy road next to the dealership. In today's episode, I try to put into words what it felt like this morning when I turned the steering wheel over to the Model 3's uncanny auto steer capability. This is driving reinvented, and it raises all sorts of intriguing questions that I hope to explore in the revived Edge of the Road podcast. I also had help from my 4-year-old grandson Jake today during my first experience at a charging station in Watertown, Massachusetts, so you'll hear from him on the episode. You'll find these at iTunes if you search for the Edge of the Road podcast, and also there's a website, theedgeoftheroad.com. I'd like to close this episode with a poem. It's one that I wrote for Darlene while we were in Omaha on our 34th wedding anniversary, May 6th. I woke up that morning without even a card to note the occasion, but Darlene and Claire were sleeping in, and that gave me a chance to come up with some verses, which she said she loves better than any poem I've ever written, and I've written a few, and a lot of them have been about her. Since part of my delight in visiting with Jim and Deb Fallows was appreciating how vibrant their marriage is after even more decades than Darlene and I have been together, I thought that I would share this poem with you, followed by a longer than usual bit of music from our traditional outro music, Ra Monk by Eval Monaghat, based on the Thelonious Monk tune, Well You Needn't. What color is love for Darlene? She loves purple, I remember that much. How those soft sweats shaped my interest when she rushed into my life decades ago. Casper, Wyoming, dust-covered and dry, made her pinks and periwinkles, magenta blush, fuchsia and lilac, all the more unforgettable. A young woman, bursting, pulsing, sighing, in colors she drew from her heart into her hands, turning fabric into art, and a cranky lost boy into a man set free from black and white. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Darlene's back in Denver with Claire, so I'm a bachelor here on my week in Cambridge, and it's been good talking with you. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my show. Have a great day. Bye.